There's something special about the mornings. The dawn's early light, the cool air and quiet breeze. The mist is almost mystical. The sounds of each new day broken only by a distant horn, the steady cadence of a horse-drawn caisson. The rolling hills are a sanctuary, standing in stark contrast, a bridge apart from a world capital that never sleeps.
I mean, this is America, and it doesn't come without a cost. And if you can impart that to your children, there is a price for living the way we want to live. Just look around and you get a sense of what that price is all about.
You can walk and walk and walk, and there's one headstone after another, different name, different state, different place, and you can leave there with a feeling that there are a lot of young men and women who are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country.
I'm proud of the fact that he's buried here, you know, and I'm proud of the fact that he served. And my grandmother always tells me that, you know, your granddad would be proud.
It started as a humble family farm. Later, it was purchased by the adopted son of George Washington, a man named John Parke Custis, who upon his death passed the estate down to his son, who in turn called it Arlington. Little did they know that these rolling hills overlooking the new nation's capital would one day become the home of a young Army lieutenant from Virginia named Robert E. Lee. Little did they know that this very land would become center stage of a civil war that would nearly destroy the very nation that Washington had fought to build. Little did they know that this ground would one day become a national treasure. It's been said that the history of America is written on the stones at Arlington National Cemetery. Each in the endless sea of white granite headstones represents a past to be remembered, a story to be told. Nearly 300,000 stories in all. Some are stories of great triumph and discovery. Others reveal the struggles of an imperfect nation. Some reflect moments of great progress and American ingenuity, while still others bring us back to times of tragedy and sadness, a tangible reminder of the cost of freedom. Arlington is the home of thousands of ordinary men and women who, through their dedication and commitment, made extraordinary contributions to our nation and the cause of freedom around the world. They understood to their very core that freedom has a price, and they paid that price. Arlington is the final home of explorers and medical pioneers, of civil rights activists and astronauts, of authors and artists, of presidents, and even a few scoundrels. Arlington is the home of the greatest among us and the least among us, a looking glass through which we see the story of America and judge for ourselves how we're living up to the ideals for which so many sacrificed so much.
I think the fact that we have all these white headstones here, and the fact that they're probably be more, because people will want to serve their country. It means that our country is in good hands. I mean, this experiment in democracy is fragile, and it takes people that are willing to serve to protect it, to fight for it.
Whoever visits Arlington is awed by their surroundings. Something cries out to them from the fields that this is a place to rest, a place to think, a place to ponder. It has been said that Arlington is the heart of the Republic.
I enjoy getting out there and looking into the cemetery, not just from the road, but deep into the cemetery, into the section where you can really see a different perspective than what you would if you're just driving up and down the road or driving by the outside gate looking in.
It's when you come upon a name on a stone. And this doesn't have to be a famous individual. It could be someone that's just famous to their friends and their families. But when you read, a name and you see the rank and you see the branch of service, then you see the date of birth and the date of death, you're meeting that person. It's an introduction. And you stop and you think, and you look at June 6, 1944, and you think, gosh, this fellow hit the beach at Normandy. And it's like talking to somebody.
Arlington National Cemetery is a piece of living history. But to the casual observer or the many school-aged children that visit Arlington, as one stop on a field trip to the nation's capital, the real significance is often lost. At most, they visit the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers, the Kennedy grave sites, or perhaps the monuments of a few notable Americans, with all else lost in the maze of nondescript white markers. But to those of any age who take the time to really explore this national treasure, to those who choose the paths less traveled and weave their way through the magnolia trees and the endless hills and valleys of Arlington, an enchanting journey of a lifetime awaits. Often the greatest stories are found in the most unlikely places. William Anderson, 1865. Walter Murphy, 1968. David Lawrence Pohl, 2004. Joseph Shoemaker, 1865. Few, if any of us, would know those names today. But pick any one, and there's a story. Ellsworth Berthoff, 1921. Born in New York City, died in New York City, buried at Arlington, as was his brother, his nephew, and his nephew's son. Certainly not a name known by most of us. Ellsworth Berthoff was not a war hero. In fact, as the story goes, his early years of military service were anything but distinguished. Appointed to the U.S. Naval Academy at age 16, Berthoff lasted less than a year, being summarily court-martialed and dismissed from the Academy for a long record of disobedience and insubordination. Undaunted, he pursued a career in the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, the forerunner to the United States Coast Guard, and served on ships along the coastal waters of the U.S. and Alaska. Then, in 1897, Berthoff led a party on the most daring midwinter rescue in maritime history, traveling overland across Alaska to save the lives of over 200 starving American whalers when their vessels were crushed in the Arctic ice. For his daring rescue, Ellsworth Berthoff was awarded the nation's highest expression of national appreciation, the Congressional Gold Medal. From his near mutinous behavior and dismissal from the Naval Academy, Berthoff went on to become the first Commandant of the United States Coast Guard, a man remembered today as the savior of the Coast Guard, as he steered the fledgling organization through the trials of World War I. Or Thomas Selfridge, United States Army, September 17, 1908. He was the first American in history to lose his life in a plane crash. In fact, at the time, he was in a plane piloted by Orville Wright. The Wright brothers were demonstrating their new flying machine to the Army for possible military applications. After 2 weeks of successful flights at Fort Myers, Orville Wright asked for an Army volunteer to accompany him. Thomas Selfridge volunteered, and the plane crashed a few hundred yards from where he is now buried. In the 1930s, there weren't many women flyers in the world. But young Irene England couldn't think of anything else growing up. When she graduated from Oceanside High School in a small town north of San Diego, Irene earned a pilot's license, and in 1943 answered the call of a nation at war for women to ferry military aircraft across the country in support of the men in battle.
My mother, of course, had started flying sometime before that, loved flying, and thought that this would be an opportunity for her to serve her country.
For 18 months, young Irene transported military supplies and injured personnel, logging over 1,200 hours flying massive B-24 bombers and other war-weary aircraft as part of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs, as they were called.
Even though they were civilians, they were brought on as civilians, they were, in a sense, an experiment as to whether women could fly military aircraft.
After logging over 60 million miles in support of the war effort, these women pilots were unceremoniously disbanded in December 1944 to make room for male pilots returning from the war.
My mother, of course, had very much wanted to stay in the military, wanted to continue flying, had actually made arrangements to do that. And when she heard that they were not eligible to be pilots, her quote was, and I've heard her say it I don't know how many times, she said, "I'm not interested in flying a desk."
The WASP flyers didn't receive any military honors or any real recognition at all for over 30 years. In fact, when they were discharged in 1944, they didn't even receive bus fare home. While most of us don't know Irene England, she and her fellow pilots were pioneers. They paved the way for so many women to follow careers in flying and other occupations previously uncharted by women. When Irene's daughter flew to New York for a final visit with her ailing mother, she remembered a ritual her mother always observed as a passenger on commercial flights. Irene would stop at the cockpit door and introduce herself as a veteran pilot of World War II. So as her daughter entered the plane that day for the last visit home, she too stopped at the cockpit door to let them know that the daughter of a World War II WASP was on board. When she looked in, she smiled with a quiet sense of pride in her mother as she saw that both pilots on the plane were women. Robert Todd Lincoln was an eyewitness to history. He was there at Lee's surrender at Appomattox. He was there when his father, President Abraham Lincoln, died from his wounds suffered at Ford's Theater. In 1881, as Secretary of War, he was there when President James Garfield was assassinated. In 1901, when he was visiting the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, he was there when President William McKinley was assassinated. From that point on, Robert Todd Lincoln refused to go to any events where a president was in attendance. He was convinced he was bad luck. Today, Robert Todd Lincoln is buried with his wife and their son, Abraham Lincoln II, at Arlington, a stone's throw from yet another assassinated president, John F. Kennedy. This one stretch of land spreading out from the grave of Robert Lincoln represents a huge portion of 20th century American history, from defining court decisions that reshaped who we are as a people, to military leaders who helped transform a world at war, to a president who represented the passing of the torch from one generation to the next.
The flyover was absolutely one of those things you'll never forget. Wave after wave of airplane, and then the president's airplane at the very end coming over the gravesite and kind of dipping its wings back and forth in a waving action. That left a lasting memory. And then the service was over. Mrs. Kennedy reached over to light the eternal flame and then departed.
President Kennedy, like every president, made many visits to Arlington National Cemetery. On one of those visits, he was in a particularly somber mood. He had just received a letter from a retired Marine Corps major thanking him for the lives he had helped save 20 years earlier in the Solomon Islands. The letter made his visit to Arlington especially moving, as the president remembered one soldier who had not been saved and saw before him a tangible reminder of the human toll of war. Kennedy so loved Arlington, he said that day, "I could stay here forever." The date was November 11, 1963. Little did the young president know that 14 days later, he himself would be laid to rest at Arlington.
What I witnessed myself was just a funeral, if you will, with a lot of important people, a lot of people you could recognize in that time, standing in the front, watching the service go on. And then as I look back now at photographs of it, of course you can say, yeah, here's all the leaders of the free world standing at one location for President Kennedy's funeral. It was quite an impressive sight to see that.
President Kennedy's funeral changed Arlington forever. In the year before his death, about 1 million people a year visited Arlington. In the years following Kennedy's funeral, that number has risen to over 4.5 million visitors each year. And while Kennedy's grave is still the most visited, the second most visited grave in Arlington Cemetery is that of the son of a poor Texas sharecropper. He came from a large family, 10 brothers and sisters. Their dire circumstances were made even worse when his father deserted the family, leaving him to help his mother raise his siblings. Then, when young Audie Leon Murphy was 16, his mother died, and with the onset of World War II, Murphy looked to the military. He was too short for the Marines or paratroopers, so he settled on the infantry. Like so many people in Arlington, Audie Murphy rose from humble beginnings to become a national hero. By the war's end and to this very day, he is the most decorated combat soldier in American history. After the war, he gained fame as an author, a musician, and in the movies. A man who lived the all-American story. When Murphy died in a plane crash in 1971, people rallied to erect an elaborate memorial on his grave at Arlington. But Murphy's widow refused. She knew her husband would not want anything special, and today his is a simple, standard-issue headstone. Another American hero buried at Arlington grew up in a humble Missouri cottage with 8 brothers and sisters. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer, but with little chance for an advanced education, he answered an ad to take a test at West Point. He won an appointment to the military academy by a single point in one subject, grammar, and thereafter achieved only marginal grades. Thus began the storied military career during which General John J. Pershing would command millions of men in World War I and become the highest-ranking officer in American military history, second only to George Washington. Pershing's final request before he died was that he be buried with the men he fought beside. And today, like Audie Murphy, General John Blackjack Pershing is buried under a simple, standard-issue headstone. General James Doolittle is also buried under a standard-issue headstone. Doolittle was the man who executed the famed World War II raid on Tokyo and the Japanese mainland in response to the invasion of Pearl Harbor. Doolittle volunteered to lead the heroic one-way mission of 16 B-25 bombers, almost certain to perish at sea or land in enemy territory. It was a mission that would electrify the world and lift the hopes of a whole nation reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor. For his valiant service, Jimmy Doolittle received the Congressional Medal of Honor. General Henry Hap Arnold was a 5-star general known as the father of the U.S. Air Force, who once trained with Orville and Wilbur Wright, and remains today the only person in U.S. military history to attain the rank of general in both the Army and the Air Force. But Hap Arnold always considered himself just a regular Joe, And in his will, he too requested his grave be marked simply by a regular, standard-issue white headstone, just like Audie Murphy, just like Black Jack Pershing, just like Jimmy Doolittle.
I think the overall theme of Arlington is that we're truly a democracy in death. Everyone is treated equally, buried side by side. It's little statements like that taken as a whole, I think, moves Arlington past just being a cemetery and perhaps being our nation's conscience.
If anything, Arlington Cemetery reflects the essence of the American ideal that all men truly are created equal, whether considered by the world as the greatest among us or the least among us. There's no more poignant example of this than the grave marked with the name James Parks. James Parks was born a slave, forced to work the fields of Arlington when it was still a private estate. James Parks never left Arlington, not because he was forced to stay, but because he loved the land. When he was freed after the Civil War, Parks chose to stay at Arlington as a groundskeeper, a position in which he served for nearly 40 years. Today, the grave of this former slave, who gave his life to Arlington, is but a few feet from that of a graduate of the Naval Academy, who went on to become a captain in the U.S. Navy.
Rank is a title and a pay grade here. Honor transcends all of that. And to remember each contribution is the same. You know, when you see the grave of a former slave next to a high-ranking Navy officer, and then come out here on Memorial Day and see each one with the American flag in front of it honored exactly the same way, that's quite a positive statement about American society.
On one of the roads less traveled at Arlington stands a memorial that most people never see. It's off the beaten path. You won't pass it on the tour bus. It would have been unthinkable in the waning years of the Civil War when the first Union soldiers were laid to rest here. Even today, there are some who still question why a memorial to the Civil War's Confederate soldiers is allowed to stand in our nation's most sacred shrine. As the Union dead accumulated in the final days of the Civil War, a man by the name of Montgomery Meigs, the Union Quartermaster General, was directed to find a place to bury the bodies. Meigs looked across the Potomac and could think of no more fitting a location to honor the Union dead than the very estate of Robert E. Lee, the man he considered a traitor responsible for the brutality of the Civil War.
About 6 months after they started the burials, General Meigs' son, who was first in his class at West Point in 1863, was killed in Shenandoah. And so General Meigs buried his son there. And there's a monument to his son that shows him in the moment of death. And then later, of course, General Meigs was buried there.
In 1866, a vault containing over 2,100 unknown soldiers discovered in and around Bull Run was capped with a granite sarcophagus that honors them as a noble army of martyrs. Meigs ultimately buried more than 16,000 Federal soldiers at Arlington, more than 400 of them in a field just below Lee's mansion. It's called the Field of the Dead, and it remains today a grim reminder of war. The bitterness and resentment of the Civil War lasted long after the last shot was fired. The wounds were deep, and it would take yet another war to bring us back together as one nation again. It wasn't until 1898 and the often overlooked Spanish-American War that the wounds of the Civil War began to heal. Remember the Maine is almost a forgotten call today, but in the years after the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898, it was a rallying cry that sparked an unprecedented unity throughout the United States. finally bringing the North and South together in a groundswell of patriotism. Today, the mast of the USS Maine is still on display at Arlington, and the 260 men lost on that ship are buried in its shadow. Amidst this new spirit of unity, in 1900, Congress authorized for the first time the placement of a permanent memorial to Confederate soldiers of the Civil War on the grounds at Arlington.
Most people just sail right by it and don't take the time to look at it and study and appreciate it. You could probably go there 4 or 5 times, and before you realize it and walk around it, you've all of a sudden picked up on the point that, gee, I'm seeing something different here. There are some 28 faces of the South: men, women, slaves, soldiers, babies, life in the South, depicted in this frieze that goes around the Confederate Memorial. And there's so much detail there that people have just, they've walked by it 100 times and never have stopped and looked at it. But once you stop and look at it and realize what's there, you say, wow, that is a magnificent piece of artwork.
The redemption of the Confederate veterans after the war is really an amazing tale. In many countries around the world, when there's a civil conflict of that type, the losers are shot, hanged, the leaders are exiled, something like that. None of that happened in this country.
The words inscribed on the Confederate Memorial are timeless and uniquely American. Not for fame or reward, not for place or rank, not lured by ambition or goaded by necessity, but in simple obedience to duty as they understood it. These men suffered all, sacrificed all, dared all, and died. With the end of the Civil War came the end of slavery, but the beginning of a long, harsh struggle for civil rights in America. Nowhere is this struggle better documented than at Arlington National Cemetery. On June 11, 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama to block the enrollment of 2 black students. President Kennedy responded quickly and federalized the Alabama National Guard to force the enrollment of those students. During the president's televised speech on civil rights the next day, a civil rights activist in Jackson, Mississippi, watched with great interest. Later that night, upon returning home, he was shot and killed in his driveway by a white supremacist. From then on, the young man named Medgar Evers came to be known as among the first martyrs of the American civil rights movement. What most people do not know, though, is that Evers was also an American war hero who was awarded 2 Bronze Stars for his bravery in storming the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. Medgar Evers is buried at Arlington. Joe Louis is considered by many the greatest boxer of all time. But it was, of course, his legendary bout with the German heavyweight Max Schmeling that provided a pivotal moment in the cause of civil rights. In 1936, Schmeling, the underdog, surprised everybody by knocking Louis out in the 12th round. Max Schmeling became Adolf Hitler's icon of the Aryan super race. But it was their historic rematch 2 years later, as Hitler's armies marched across Europe, that galvanized all of America, white and black, young and old, in support of the Brown Bomber. Joe Louis knocked Schmeling out in the first round. He would go on to serve in the U.S. Army, and ultimately he was awarded the Legion of Merit. Upon his death in 1981, the greatest boxers in history traveled to Arlington to attend Joe Louis's funeral. The man who traveled the farthest was Max Schmeling. Thurgood Marshall was the grandson of a slave who went on to become one of the greatest constitutional lawyers in the 20th century. In 1930, at age 22, he was denied admission to a prominent law school because he was black, an event that would ultimately define his entire professional life. After earning a law degree from Howard University, he became a true champion of civil rights in America, winning 32 of 35 cases he argued before the Supreme Court, including the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education. In June 1967, Thurgood Marshall became the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court. But even beyond the famous names, Arlington is filled with unknown heroes of the civil rights movement. Daniel James, the first black four-star general in military history, or Benjamin Oliver Davis, the first African American to hold the rank of general in the Army. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates. Colonel Bates was the white commander of the 1st Black Tank Battalion to fight in World War II. As part of General Patton's Third Army, the battalion fought for 183 consecutive days without relief. Colonel Bates refused a promotion to stay with his men. He was so moved by their bravery. But the real story of Paul Bates happened far from the battlefield, at a segregated boot camp in Texas. At Fort Hood, a young black officer was charged with insubordination after refusing to move to the back of a transport bus. But on principle, Colonel Bates refused to court-martial the young soldier for his actions. Instead, the man was acquitted and went on to leave the Army for professional baseball. His name was Jackie Robinson. Henry Johnson was an African-American soldier in World War I, the first American of any race to receive the Croix de Guerre, the highest military honor bestowed by France. After being wounded 21 times, he risked what remaining life he had to rescue a fallen comrade. Theodore Roosevelt called Johnson one of the 5 bravest Americans of World War I. America is anything but a perfect nation. The stones at Arlington show us that. But so too do they reveal a nation willing to change, to right the wrongs of the past and try to move forward. A nation where any man or any woman can be a hero, a true patriot, a place where any life can make a difference.
The Sentinel's Creed. My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted, and the responsibility bestowed on me never will I falter, and with dignity and perseverance my standard will remain perfection. Through the years of diligence and praise and the discomfort of the elements,
I will walk my tour in humble reverence to the best of my ability.
It is he who commands the respect I protect, his bravery that made us so proud, surrounded by well-meaning crowds by day, alone in the thoughtful peace of night.
This soldier will in honor glory rest under my eternal vigilance.
Surrounded by well-meaning crowds by day, alone in the thoughtful peace of night, this soldier will in honored glory rest under my eternal vigilance. Simon, 1971.
At the gates of Arlington National Cemetery, a simple sign reads that this is our nation's most sacred shrine. The most hallowed portion of the cemetery is a small plot of land we know as the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers. The Tomb of the Unknowns is guarded rain or shine, 24 hours a day, every day, an endless tribute to soldiers who lost not only their lives, but their identities. At this very moment, a lonely sentinel marches the path in front of the tomb. 21 paces, pause for 21 counts, then return 21 paces, back and forth through the coldest nights or the warmest days. It says something about our nation when the most hallowed portion of our most sacred shrine is dedicated to a group of individuals whose names and ranks we will never know.
We as a nation have decided it's valuable to us to dedicate those soldiers to be there every day and never, ever, ever, ever forget what that Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and what every one of those gravestones means to America.
There are nearly 5,000 unknowns that are honored at Arlington National Cemetery, all of whom made a contribution to our nation. One of the most profound and moving locations in the cemetery is simply known as Section 27. It lies at the far north end of the cemetery, a long walk from the graves of the Kennedy brothers or the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers. Most people never see Section 27. Section 27 today houses the graves of more than 3,800 former slaves from what was called Freedmen's Village. In 1862, President Lincoln emancipated the slaves in Washington, D.C. Shortly thereafter, a settlement called Freedmen's Village was established to house the freed slaves at Arlington. The Freedmen's Village lasted for over 30 years. Government workers provided help in building schools and hospitals and housing. Sojourner Truth was appointed to look after the welfare of those former slaves. Most of the headstones are marked only with the words citizen or civilian. Some of the markers are engraved with the now politically incorrect USCT, United States Colored Troops. But that simple word, citizen, represents the beginning of a revolution in American culture. Men and women born as slaves, who in their death for the first time were honored with the title citizen.
You know, when you read their names and their ranks and you see that unusual delineation of USCT, I stop and think, wow, these soldiers know more about fighting for their freedom than any American soldier before or since. I mean, they're literally fighting for their freedom from slavery. To go from being someone's property, to go from being a slave, to being a citizen of the United States of America is a quantum leap. You know, to go from being someone else's property to someone that has the same protection as you or I under the Constitution is truly reflective of what our American government is about.
At Arlington, American history is not black and white words on a page, because you're standing within feet of the very people who wrote the American story, people whose lives changed the landscape of our culture. General George C. Marshall was the author of the Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. Marshall was not only one of America's greatest military leaders, but also is the only member of any military in history to ever receive the Nobel Prize for Peace. Earl Warren not only led the Warren Commission investigating the assassination of President Kennedy, but as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he also wrote the unanimous decision in that landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. Arlington is filled with pioneers. Pioneers in medicine like Walter Reed, who discovered the cause of yellow fever and ultimately became the namesake for the famed Army Medical Center. And Albert Sabin, who developed the oral polio vaccine, credited with saving millions of lives since 1965. And Anita McGee, the first woman Army surgeon in U.S. history. Arlington is filled with pioneers in the national security field who fought gallantly behind the scenes for our country while avoiding any public recognition. From William Wild Bill Donovan, founder of the OSS, the World War II forerunner of the CIA, to Francis Gary Powers, whose U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. From Richard Helms, the director of Central Intelligence during the Vietnam War, to Johnny Michael Spann, the CIA agent who became the first American casualty of the War on Terror when he was killed in 2001 by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Many memorials honor important events in American history. A tribute to Theodore Roosevelt's famed Rough Riders, a memorial to the fallen rescuers who died in Iran trying to free American hostages, a tribute to honor the victims of Pan Am Flight 103. A nurses' memorial stands in Section 21 to honor the sacrifices of military nurses throughout our history. And the first memorial visitors see is the Women in Military Service Memorial, prominently placed at the very entrance of Arlington Cemetery. Just outside the gates of Arlington is the famous Marine Corps Iwo Jima Memorial. The enormous statue is sculpted in the image of perhaps the most famous photograph in military history. 3 men shown in the photograph and depicted on the memorial today rest at Arlington. 2 monuments that stand not far from the Memorial Amphitheater at the center of Arlington immortalize modern tragedies etched vividly in the memories of millions of Americans. One for the Space Shuttle Challenger, containing remains of the 7-member crew, and a newer memorial to the Space Shuttle Columbia. Arlington is filled with American explorers who pushed the boundaries of the known world, pioneers whose names are taught in every schoolroom to every student in the country. The team of Admiral Richard Byrd and Floyd Bennett made history in the early 20th century by becoming the first men ever to fly over the North Pole. In doing so, both men were awarded peacetime Congressional Medals of Honor. After Floyd Bennett's untimely death in 1928, Richard Byrd teamed up with Bernt Balken to become the first men to fly over the South Pole. So devastated was Byrd by the death of his friend Floyd Bennett that he took a stone from Bennett's grave at Arlington and tossed it from his plane directly over the South Pole. Adolphus Greely, co-founder of the National Geographic Society, fought in the Civil War, then volunteered to lead the official U.S. military expedition to the Arctic as part of the International Polar Year in 1882. Greely, too, won the Congressional Medal of Honor for his mission, and while he and his men never made it to the North Pole, famed Arctic explorer Robert Edwin Peary did. Peary was buried with full military honors shortly after his death in 1920. The National Geographic Society erected a memorial at his gravesite to commemorate his historic journey to the North Pole. Over the years, one of the most frequent visitors to Peary's grave was a man named Matthew Henson, a former Washington, D.C. clothing store clerk who had become a longtime friend and a collaborator on many of Peary's Arctic expeditions. With Peary's help, Henson became an expert dog sled driver and an avid explorer. After several failed expeditions, Peary, with his trusted companion Henson, heroically conquered the Arctic and reached the North Pole on April 6, 1909. It was Henson, though, that actually was the very first to plant the American flag on the pole. Ultimately, Peary was hailed as a national hero and went down in history. Henson, on the other hand, received little credit and drifted off into obscurity, taking a job at a Harlem garage. Upon his death in 1955, Henson was buried at a cemetery in the Bronx, New York, his grave marked with a small, inconsequential inscription that read only, "Reach the North Pole with Peary." In 1986, Henson's heroic story was brought to light, and after an authorization by President Reagan on April 6, 1988, 79 years after reaching the pole, Henson and his wife were buried at Arlington with military honors in a grave adjacent to Robert Peary.
We all play a role, and our role is very important, and we've got to come together. This is, in my view, a very dangerous time.
On the morning of September 11, 2001, our nation was changed forever. So was Arlington Cemetery. The September 11th memorial at Arlington is in many ways the most breathtaking of all, because unlike so many historical monuments, it represents a defining moment for this generation of Americans. It stands prophetically between the Pentagon, where 184 men and women lost their lives that day, and Section 60, where today we honor the fallen heroes in the War on Terror. For the families who lost their loved ones, the 9/11 Memorial has become a place to express their sorrow, a starting point as they continue to rebuild their lives.
I hope they understand that there are a lot of us that very much appreciate the sacrifices that their family members made, and that they have a sense of healing, knowing that the entire country is, in a sense, putting their arms around them. And that's what this site's about.
Walking through the September 11th Memorial, or past the new graves in Section 60, which bear the remains of many of those killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, changes how we view the rest of the cemetery. We're left with a new understanding that this is all very real indeed. The tragedy of a funeral of a young soldier killed in Iraq gives us a vivid picture of what it was like when young soldiers were sent home from the beaches of Normandy, or the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta, or the fields of Gettysburg. Arlington Cemetery, above all, is the home of our heroes, those who bravely faced the horrors of war on obscure battlefields around the world, throughout the whole sweep of American history. Heroes like Robert R. Scott, machinist mate first class, United States Navy, who on December 7, 1941, gave his life when he continued to operate a compressor to provide air for his fellow crew members trapped below deck on the USS California during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Or Bob McGovern, who single-handedly charged a Chinese position in the Korean War and sacrificed himself to save his men who were hopelessly pinned down by enemy gunfire. Jerome McGovern was unaware of his brother's sacrifice when 15 days later, he did the same thing and gave his own life to save his platoon. Heroes like Captain Umberto Versace, whose bravery and leadership in captivity in North Vietnam never stopped inspiring his fellow prisoners, and up to his very execution, was heard singing "God Bless America" at the top of his lungs. No matter what the year, no matter what the war, the story is always the same, and the heroes of Arlington keep coming. On April 4, 2003, Paul Ray Smith and his task force came under heavy fire. Realizing that more than 100 fellow soldiers were in danger, Smith personally engaged the enemy with hand grenades and anti-tank weapons and organized the evacuation of 3 wounded soldiers from a damaged armored personnel carrier. Paul Ray Smith gave his own life to save the lives of his men in the finest traditions of the American soldier, and was recognized with our nation's highest honor as the first in the Iraq War to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. When Sam Huff was 16 and a junior at Mountain View High School in Tucson, Arizona, she shocked her parents. Sam was a popular girl, full of life and curiosity, determined to make a difference in the world, and known as much for her caring heart as her social grace and striking beauty. Sam loved music and dancing. She loved Disney ballads and leading the Mountain View Marching Band. So it was a shock to her parents when Sam, at age 16, told them she wanted to go into the Army. She had a plan, she said. She'd serve her country first, then go to college to study psychology, then go to work for the FBI. Sam could have done almost anything in life, for beneath her feminine beauty was a rare combination of tough, determined inner strength and a soft, compassionate heart. So Sam stuck to her plan, and after the rigors of basic training, Private First Class Sam Huff was deployed to Iraq as part of the 170th Military Police Company. When her sergeant first saw his new recruit, he shook his head and said, 5 feet nothing, 100 pounds of nothing. But the sergeant soon discovered, as he would later say, beneath that beautiful young lady was a backbone of steel. So committed was Sam Huff that despite the risks she knew all too well, she often remarked to her fellow soldiers that she wouldn't change where she was for anything in the world. On April 17, 2005, while returning from guarding an Iraqi police station, the vehicle she was riding in was hit by a roadside bomb. Sam was critically injured. She quietly asked the sergeant next to her to pass along a message to her parents. He said, "No, you'll be able to make the call yourself." Sam responded, "No, I don't think I can make it. Tell my mom I love her, and tell my dad good luck with his album." Today, the 18-year-old girl with an inner strength and spirit well beyond her years is resting at Arlington.
They served willfully and proudly, and they've lost their life in service to their country. And I think that as Americans, we're touched by that. We're moved by that. And in many cases, we don't quite understand it. What motivates them to go and take those risks? And that comes back to a big word that's patriotism.
I think it engenders more than anything else pride in this uniform, pride in knowing that out here are their comrades that they don't know, that are in most cases nameless and faceless, but they have a bond with them that is unbreakable.
I'm not struck when I'm at Arlington Cemetery with fear or worry. I'm struck with life.
People need to understand that the Secretary of Defense can see Arlington Cemetery from his office. The Secretary is constantly aware of the cost of war, the human cost.
That moment when the honor guard passes the American flag that's been draped over the casket to the surviving spouse, sometimes a surviving mother or father, that's a tough moment. At the same time, it's a proud moment.
Wrapped up in the powerful stories that make Arlington what it is, are the stories that make America what it is. Arlington, in all its tragedy, in all its heroism and triumph, gives us a picture of America as a whole, a powerful metaphor for what really makes our nation great. Arlington National Cemetery, in all its beauty and reverence, is far more than a final resting place for men and women who gave the last full measure of devotion for their country. For Arlington is not a memorial to the death of anyone. Rather, it is a true and enduring celebration of life. A celebration of lives well lived, of mostly unknown, ordinary Americans who made extraordinary contributions for people they would never know, for families they would never meet. And so it remains today. America is great not because we're strong and rich, not because we can do whatever we want or because we're free to enjoy our lives. These are merely byproducts of something deeper and more important. Every marker at Arlington National Cemetery affirms this point. But are future generations listening to the broader statements this national treasure is making? Have we forgotten the lessons of Arlington? Have we grown so comfortable in our lives and confident in our future that we're no longer conscious that freedom is not free? In a powerful speech now inscribed at his gravesite at Arlington, President Kennedy said, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty." There's no greater testimony to those words than Arlington.